welcome to CapitolView, where we discuss the latest in state government and politics. I'm Hannah Meisel with NPR Illinois. Joining us this week is Dave Dahl with a public Springfield radio station, WTAX. Thanks for being here, Dave.
Thank you, Hannah.
And also here is Peter Hancock of Capitol News Illinois. Glad you're here, Peter.
Hi, Hannah.
Well, for midsummer, it seemed like a pretty busy week in Illinois politics. Governor J.B. Pritzker over the last week has signed some interesting new laws, and I hope to get to that later in the program. But there's been something brewing here that I think we need to spend a lot of today's show talking about. We're 11 months out primary election next summer, and obviously we saw Governor Pritzker announced his re-election campaign last week. On the Republican side, we have 3 announced candidates for governor so far, though there are likely more who will get into the race, possibly Congressman Rodney Davis, as we've discussed before, but there could be others. But we are seeing something in this 3-way primary that I think you could say is emblematic of a lot of the things that we've seen over the last year and a half during the pandemic, but also over the last, several years. As the information age has kind of sped up to the speed of light, and disinformation has become such an issue in politics especially. And Peter, I want to start with you. Our colleague Mark Maxwell this week has done some reporting on whether or not these gubernatorial candidates on the Republican side are vaccinated, what they think of vaccines, their messaging around vaccines. And, it's been very interesting and illustrative to see their responses, whether they're vaccinated, whether they believe in vaccines. So Peter, can you just fill us in who on the Republican side is vaccinated and who is not? And, what are their general messages about the COVID vaccines?
Well, I'm not sure we know who all of the Republican field is right now, but certainly you have Gary Rabin, I believe is a Chicago businessman, and then from Southern Illinois you have Darren Bailey, and they've both been messaging a lot of skepticism about vaccines and a lot of antagonism toward it. To me, it's really interesting. I think back to the last time this country saw anything this widespread and this dangerous was maybe the polio epidemic, which lasted for, 40 or 50 years in the first half of the 20th century. And when Jonas Salk came out with his vaccine for polio, you didn't have to convince people to go get it. They just did. But that was in an age where the media, news media and communications were a lot more tightly controlled, you might say, and there are people now on the airwaves who in the 1950s never would have seen the business side of a television camera. So there is a lot of misinformation out there, and it's really very concerning.
Right. Our colleague Mark Maxwell, he had Gary Rabin on his show on WCIA this past weekend, and Gary Rabin was, peddling some misinformation, claiming that people had died from the vaccine, which we know is not true. And his campaign spokesman, had to walk that back, but it seems that Gary Rabin is back to peddling that same lie. And Darren Bailey, like you said, he is skeptical of vaccines. Neither of them are vaccinated. The third declared candidate so far, a former state senator from the Waterloo area, Paul Schimpf, he says he is vaccinated. He thinks that vaccines are effective for adults, and he encourages other adults to get vaccinated. But, this is all in a time where we are seeing, unfortunately, the return of COVID, the Delta variant, which we know is, 50% more contagious than the UK variant, which was 50% more contagious than the original SARS-CoV-2 virus. Unfortunately, we are seeing another spike, not just in Illinois, but nationwide. It's at the same time that schools are getting ready to open back up for classes in the fall in just a few weeks here. And there are fights about mask mandates or not. And we saw the CDC this week reverse its guidance for whether you should be masked indoors, whether or not you're vaccinated. So Dave, this is at a very interesting turning point. What do you think comes next when we are already seeing vaccine uptake slow to an absolute crawl, the return of COVID, and people being less willing to go into any other, mitigations or anything like that. And at the same time, these folks who are running for this high profile office spreading misinformation about vaccines.
Well, I don't know if it's a vestige of Donald Trump being elected, but that coincided with a lot of people feeling enabled to say whatever they want, to say no. Polio was mentioned. I mean, that was when that was before I was born, but I get the idea there was a lot more unity in the country, a lot more shared experience, and this vaccine is going to be good for us, and it's going to, wipe out polio because we don't want polio. And now in 2021, you've got, just for example, some people running for governor say, and, it wasn't that long ago that I couldn't say on TV, but I just did. And what are you going to do about it? And so I think that's an attitude which people are able to express out loud. And, now it is okay to do that, where, some years ago, you absolutely wouldn't do that. So it's probably going to more and more fracture the nation and, to that extent, our state.
And Peter, you, prior to coming to Illinois, you covered Kansas politics for a really long time. Did you, before you left Kansas, you saw things like your governor, Sam Brownback, embrace a very low income tax that, in fact, put state funding, especially for schools, so much at risk that, they had to go back and reverse that. And, I think it's really interesting that Republicans here in Illinois have been playing kind of a catch-up game. For a long time. Republicans in Illinois, they felt as if they were kind of shielded from what was going on in the larger context of the GOP in Washington and in other parts of the country. But, a lot of the Republican establishment here and now, they are looking around and they are wondering what to do with candidates who go rogue or elected officials who get elected to office and then go rogue. And, it's hard for them to control the message. So what did you see in Kansas? How did you see that evolution play out? And do you think that it's a cautionary tale for Republicans here in Illinois?
I think it is. And for the benefit of viewers, Governor Sam Brownback was very much out of the same cloth as Governor Bruce Rauner here in Illinois. He was very ideological in his approach. And in some ways, you saw a lot of the same denial of facts. He put in this very controversial tax plan, which it's too complicated to get into, but state revenues just plummeted. And of course, he said, tried to shift the blame for that onto other things in the economy. But it was happening at a time when the US economy wasn't doing all that bad. It was just, the idea was that if you cut taxes for businesses and entrepreneurs, then they will reinvest that and hire more people. And you'll see economic growth, and these tax cuts would pay for themselves. And of course, they didn't. It's very seldom that tax cuts ever pay for themselves. You cut taxes, you cut revenue. And so it was, you also have a political culture there that allows for rogue candidates. Political parties really have very little control over their own candidates, their own office holders. People are kind of pretty much out there on their own. There's a lot more influence, especially among Republicans, from outside groups, the anti-abortion movement, groups like Club for Growth and Americans for Prosperity, groups that are funded by, used to be primarily funded by Koch brothers, Koch Industries, which is based in Wichita, Kansas. So, you know, in some ways, I get a little concerned. I mean, you've been seeing this denial of facts and denial of science building for some time. In the 1960s, there was pushback against seatbelt mandates. And then in the 1970s, there was pushback against environmental regulation. More recently, there's been incredible pushback against climate science. And it becomes politicized when political groups don't like the responses that science calls for, and therefore they deny the science. And I think that's part of what you're seeing here with vaccines and with mask mandates. People don't like being told what to do. They don't like being told that you have to wear these silly masks over your face that make it hard to breathe. And they feel like their freedom is being threatened by this. And so they basically deny the science that calls for it. And now you have a media environment that just feeds off of this, with cable news channels, with internet websites, Facebook and Twitter. You know, it's like a very fertile garden for that kind of misinformation. And it's not just in Illinois, it's not just in Kansas. This is happening on really a global scale right now.
And I want to be perfectly clear. It's not just the far right who is guilty of misinformation. You see elements of the far left who, you know, have just as powerful almost, you know, Facebook pages, Facebook groups who also push disinformation. You also have, you know, the anti-vax movement. You know, you could argue some started with folks on the left. You could call them, you know, crunchy granola types. You know, San Francisco. You know, folks who want to live quote unquote naturally. But it is demonstrably true, you know, there is a lot of data on this, that the pages on social media that have the most reach are far right. And, you know, you see this over and over, the outrage cycles that begin and end, you know, they just feed on each other. And it's folks who, if you trace it back, which people smarter than me have done, you know, it's to, you know, sometimes content farms and people who profit off of this stuff and make it into an industry. But Dave, you know, what do you think, you know, you've covered Illinois politics for a long time. What are the changes that you've seen in recent years for how messages are how you know, candidates can go rogue from either party?
Well, I think to answer that question and to tie in what Peter and I have just said, you know, if you've got an iPhone and a Facebook or YouTube account, you're in the media. And it used to be that, you know, at 5:30 at night, you'd sit down and watch the network news, you know, and now about all that's good for is to watch the commercials and see what prescription meds they ought to be on. And you used to have one or two newspapers arrive at your doorstep. And now, you know, almost anybody out there can be on the same plane as the, you know, the opinion shapers, the news gatekeepers of years ago. And so you can have a candidate put on their own blog, their own YouTube, etc., and speak directly to the voter, the potential voter. And it's not just an Illinois phenomenon, but if I want to go to, Hannah Meisel for dogcatcher.com, I can get your message directly to me, not filtered by the media. And because, as if all of the media have a daily meeting to decide what the media is going to say. But the other thing, ideologically, you look at somebody like, and I'm not the first to say this, Jim Edgar. I mean, would Republicans even nominate him today? It seems like to get yourself heard, you ought to be, farther to the right. And you mentioned Rodney Davis. I mean, if he gets into the race, he's going to have Darren Bailey following him around, calling him a pinko or something because he's not conservative enough. And so I think people who want to be, in the middle are going to find it a little problematic. On the other hand, if you're on the right in Illinois, the farther right, how many votes are there out there for you really to count on? So I think it's, highly layered and nuanced. And you see that the strategy of the Republicans, at least in statewide politics, hasn't worked all that well in the numbers. They're a super minority in the state house and in the state Senate and in the U.S. House, and the Republicans have none of the statewide races now. So, it'll be interesting to see what kind of gains they can make and where they think the potential is. And, I'm not saying that to espouse a particular point other than, look who the math is working for. You can't deny math.
Sure. I want to, Paul Schimpf, like we mentioned before, a former state senator who's also in this race. It's interesting because he is not getting on the outrage train, at least nearly as much as Darren Bailey or Gary Rabine. But he's just not garnering a whole ton of support right now. Like we said, it is early days. We still have 11 more months of this, but fundraising numbers don't seem to show a lot of enthusiasm behind his campaign. Obviously, we haven't seen the big GOP donors weigh in yet. But for folks like him, is he getting left behind because the party has bought into, folks who are, the fire and brimstone folks? And it's the same thing in the Democratic Party too, I would say. Former House Speaker Mike Madigan, both as House Speaker and as chair of the Democratic Party, he did a lot to protect moderate Democrats. There were a lot of folks who are, up until several years ago, you could say there were a lot of pro-life Democrats still in the Illinois Democratic Party serving in public office. But, in this social media era, being moderate, being polite, folding your hands and, kind of taking your lumps, it's just not the thing that voters want. And so, Peter, do you see that this has any sort of natural end for both parties to, because again, we've seen it in Washington, we've seen the two parties play a part, but Illinois has been, kind of 10 years behind that trend, maybe. Do you see any natural end for this in Illinois specifically?
Well, that's hard to say. I think we do live in an age where good television is good politics. And the more outrageous you can be, the more flamboyant, the more showy you can be, that's what gets you attention. I will say that in Illinois, if you look back at recent high-profile statewide races, whether it's for governor, for president, for U.S. Senate, any given Democratic nominee goes in with a presumed 8 to 10 point advantage. You're looking at 55, 45, maybe 53, 47, something like that. In order for the Republicans to reverse that, they need to get 6 or 7 percentage points away from Governor Pritzker and move it over to their column. That's anywhere from, depending on turnout, 250,000 to 300,000 votes. I don't think you're going to do that. You get that many Democrats to move away from Pritzker and toward a Republican with this politics of outrage, the outrage train that you were talking about. By and large, I mean, you're going to have it. That kind of politics isn't going to work. I think, if you have a more moderate candidate who can appeal across lines, maybe somebody like Rodney Davis, he would definitely be a heavy hitter. I don't know what Adam Kinzinger's plans are right now. It would have to be somebody like that to really make a dent in the lead, the natural lead that Democrats already have.
Well, would the state party buy into that, Peter? Would they give, their blessing? Now, you mentioned the fundraising and all that. I think some of the big Republican donors just may be, waiting it out to see who really gets into the race and who the contenders really are. The other thing that's kind of a wild card in here is we're having a first and last time only late June primary. What's that going to do to turnout?
That's hard to say. We've never, Illinois has never had this. I can tell you that, back in Kansas, their primaries are in early August. So they have a very short general election cycle. Some people there say it's still too long, but their primaries are notoriously low turnout. People are on vacation. And as far as moderate Republicans go, I had a friend who used to kind of joke that they better not hold primary on the same day they're having a sale at Nordstrom's. Because the moderate Republicans wouldn't turn out. So it's going to be interesting. I think political scientists all over the state will be watching this to see what kind of an impact this change in the calendar has on voter turnout.
Well, and the Republicans running against how awful Pritzker is and how he's mishandled the whole pandemic. What Venn diagram shows overlap between, for example, Pritzker and Bailey? Who's going to say, I voted for Pritzker, but now he's really let me down. He's dissatisfied me. And so I really think I'm voting for Bailey. I mean, how many people are there who would say that?
Not very many. I think Darren Bailey is somebody who is probably not recognized very far north of I-72 or maybe even I-64. He's very much a Southern Illinois person. So the people who are going to vote for Darren Bailey are people who would never vote for J.B. Pritzker to begin with. So he's not taking anything away from Pritzker. I think if I were in Pritzker's seat, I would be much more worried about a moderate Republican candidate, someone who's not quite as edgy, someone who's got a little more charm and personality. And somebody who can raise an awful lot of money because Republicans not only have to compete against the inherent advantage that Democrats have, but they have to compete against a man who can spend $150 million out of his own pocket and not even feel it.
Getting people on the ground all over the state. That's what it's going to take.
That is true. I think one of the things that politicians, we saw the governor lose the fair tax back in November, and some of the postmortems I've seen blame just the lack of on the ground campaigning, the door-to-door campaigning. Obviously it was COVID, but there were other factors at play too. I think a lot of political strategists maybe got caught up in spending on advertisements that maybe there weren't actually a lot of eyeballs that didn't work. But we're almost out of time. I thought today's conversation was kind of an experiment. It's social media isn't everything. Obviously, we should say it's July 2021. Most voters are not paying attention to the gubernatorial primary that's going to happen literally 11 months from now. But I do think that it's a conversation worth having because it is something that we're seeing brewing that, we could have to look back on later, and, these are the seeds of, possibly even more division, if you can believe that. Again, Illinois Republicans and Democrats have kind of viewed themselves as a special kind of case where we're more insulated from national politics. But, with leaders, especially, we new Democratic House Speaker Chris Welch, especially, he has really stepped up the rhetoric against Republicans. And I think that's going to be really interesting to see going forward. Will Illinois no longer be this kind of place of collegial, across the aisle, at least making steps toward that. But we're out of time. I want to thank our guests, Dave Dahl and Peter Hancock. I'm Hannah Meisel. Please catch us again next week on Capitol View.